Black principal reunites with long-lost classmates at school reunion. The gymnasium of Westridge High School looked different after 20 years. Streamers in the school colors, navy and gold, hung from the ceiling, and circular tables dressed in white cloths dotted the polished floor. Dr. Marcus Johnson stood alone at the entrance, straightening his tie for the third time. As principal of the very school he once attended, he'd walked through these doors countless times, but tonight was different. Tonight he wasn't Principal Johnson, he was just Marcus, class of 2005. "Dr. Johnson, you made it." Marcus turned to see Alyssa Chen, now the school's art teacher, approaching with 2 glasses of punch. Her smile was warm, genuine. "I wasn't sure you would come. What with?" She trailed off, handing him a glass. Marcus accepted it with a nod. "What with my history here?" The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken memories. Across the room, a group of former classmates noticed his arrival. Among them stood Richard Keller, once the football team's star quarterback and Marcus's chief tormentor. Their eyes met, and Richard's expression shifted: surprise, recognition, something else Marcus couldn't quite place. Richard whispered something to the others, and several heads turned toward the entrance. "They remember you," Alyssa said quietly. "Question is," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the sudden tightness in his chest, "which version of me do they remember?" As he watched Richard approach, Marcus felt the weight of 20 years of memories pressing down on him. Could people truly change from who they once were? And even if they had, could the wounds of the past ever fully heal? The moral calculus of forgiveness stretched before him like an unsolvable equation. Marcus Johnson had always loved learning. As a child, he would spend hours in the public library, devouring books on everything from ancient civilizations to astrophysics. His parents, his father a postal worker, his mother an elementary school secretary, had instilled in him a reverence for education that bordered on the sacred. "Knowledge is the one thing they can never take from you," his father would say, a mantra repeated so often it became the background music of Marcus's childhood. By the time he entered Westridge High School in 2001, Marcus was academically gifted but socially reserved. Tall and lanky, with thoughtful eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, he kept to himself, finding sanctuary in books and the praise of teachers who recognized his potential. Westridge was a study in contrasts, a public school in a district that straddled affluent neighborhoods and working-class communities. The social hierarchy was as rigid as it was unspoken, with wealth, athletic prowess, and conformity determining one's place. As one of only 7 black students in his class, Marcus occupied a liminal space respected by teachers but largely invisible to his peers, except when his academic achievements made him a target. Richard Keller embodied everything Marcus was not. The son of the town's most successful real estate developer, Richard moved through the hallways of Westridge with the easy confidence of someone who had never questioned his place in the world. Handsome, athletic, and carelessly cruel, he wielded his popularity like a weapon. "Hey, Einstein," Richard would call out whenever he spotted Marcus in the hallway. "Solve this equation. U plus a social life equals O. Wait, that's impossible." His followers would laugh on cue, the sound echoing down the corridor as Marcus kept his eyes fixed on the floor, his face burning with shame and anger. Alyssa Chen had been different. Artistic and independent-minded, she existed on the periphery of the popular crowd, invited to their parties but never fully embraced. She and Marcus had been lab partners in AP chemistry, forming a cautious friendship over Bunsen burners and periodic tables. "Don't let them get to you," she'd advised once after a particularly vicious taunt from Richard. "They peak in high school. You're going to peak when it actually matters." Then there was Dexter Washington, another black student who had navigated the social complexities of Westridge with a chameleon-like ability to blend in. A talented athlete but not a star, funny but not the class clown, Dexter had achieved a kind of social neutrality that Marcus both envied and resented. "You need to learn to play the game, man," Dexter had told him once. "Keep your head down, laugh at their jokes sometimes, don't always raise your hand even when you know the answer." But Marcus couldn't or wouldn't adapt. His refusal to compromise made him simultaneously admirable and alienated. The incident happened during their senior year. Marcus had been nominated for a prestigious scholarship that would cover his full tuition at any university in the country. When word got out, Richard and his friends plastered the school with doctored photos of Marcus, captions suggesting he had received the nomination only because of affirmative action and diversity quotas. The school administration had done little in response. "Boys will be boys," the principal had said with an uncomfortable shrug. And the photos were taken down before most students saw them. But Marcus had seen them, and so had the scholarship committee members who visited the school that day. He still received the scholarship, went to Cornell, earned his doctorate in education. And now, through a twist of fate that sometimes felt like poetic justice, he had returned to Westridge as its principal 7 years ago, determined to create the safe and equitable learning environment he had been denied. As he took his first sip of punch, watching Richard Keller cross the gymnasium floor toward him, Marcus wondered if the boy who had made his high school years so difficult could possibly have changed as much as the man who had once been his victim. "Marcus Johnson," Richard said, extending his hand. His voice had lost the arrogant edge of youth, replaced by something more measured. "It's been a long time." Marcus hesitated for only a moment before accepting the handshake. "Richard." An awkward silence stretched between them, 20 years of unspoken history filling the space. "I heard you're the principal now," Richard finally said. "That's impressive." "And you?" Marcus asked, though he already knew. He had made it his business to know about all his former classmates, partly out of curiosity, partly as armor. "Commercial real estate, following in my dad's footsteps," Richard replied with a self-deprecating smile that seemed foreign on the face Marcus remembered. "Nothing as noble as molding young minds." Alyssa shifted beside them. "I should check on the refreshments," she said, clearly sensing the tension. "I'll catch up with you both later." As she walked away, Richard cleared his throat. "Look, I know this is weird, us talking like normal people after everything." Marcus maintained his composure, the skill honed through years of managing difficult parents and board meetings. "We are normal people, Richard, just older ones." Before Richard could respond, a voice boomed from behind them. "Well, if it isn't the two guys who never could stand each other, world really does turn upside down, doesn't it?" Dexter Washington approached, broader and heavier than in high school, but with the same easy smile. He clapped a hand on each of their shoulders. "Principal Johnson and businessman Keller, who'd have thought?" "Good to see you, Dex," Marcus said, genuinely pleased despite the interruption. "How's Charlotte?" "Still putting up with me," Dexter laughed. 20 years, 3 kids, and a dog later, she's over there with Melissa Thompson, remember her? Track team." Marcus nodded, scanning the room. More former classmates were arriving. Jennifer Abrams, who had gone from head cheerleader to state senator. Carlos Rodriguez, once a quiet band kid, now a renowned composer. Sarah Winters, the debate team captain who became a public defender. Each face carried memories, some pleasant, many painful. The gymnasium was rapidly becoming a living museum of his past, exhibits of joy and trauma on display with punch and finger foods. "I need some air," Marcus said abruptly, stepping away from Richard and Dexter. "Excuse me." He pushed through the double doors into the hallway, where glass cases displayed athletic trophies and academic achievements. His own photo hung among the line of principals, his expression serious and dignified. Principal Dr. Marcus Johnson, the brass plate read. The first black principal in Westridge's 82-year history. "Running away again, Einstein?" Marcus turned to find Richard standing in the hallway behind him. "Old habits," Marcus replied, his tone carefully neutral. Richard stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Can we talk, really talk?" Something in his former bully's voice, a note of genuine entreaty, made Marcus nod despite his reservations. "My office is just down the hall." As they walked, the familiar sounds of the reunion laughter, music, the clinking of glasses faded behind them. Marcus used his key to unlock the administrative wing, leading Richard to the principal's office. It was a space Marcus had deliberately designed to be both authoritative and welcoming. African masks and prints hung alongside framed diplomas and educational awards. Books lined one wall, while another displayed student artwork and achievements. "Quite a step up from Principal Harrison's office," Richard observed, taking in the space. "I spent enough time there to know." Marcus sat behind his desk, the position granting him a sense of control he needed for this conversation. "You wanted to talk, so talk." Richard remained standing, hands in his pockets. "I was horrible to you in high school." "Yes," Marcus agreed, offering nothing more. "I've thought about it a lot over the years," Richard continued. "Especially after my oldest started high school, wondering if someone was treating her the way I treated you." He paced the office, stopping to examine a photo on the wall, Marcus with a group of students, all smiling widely after a science competition victory. "The thing is," Richard said, his back still to Marcus, "I don't even know why I did it, or I do, but the reasons seem so pathetic now." "Try me," Marcus said, surprising himself with the challenge. Richard turned, meeting his eyes directly. "You were everything I wasn't, Smart without trying, genuine, uncompromising. My dad was always writing me about my grades, telling me I'd never amount to anything if I didn't get serious. Then there you were, acing every test, winning every academic award. He shook his head. And you didn't even seem to care what anyone thought of you. I both hated and envied that. The explanation hung in the air between them, insufficient yet uncomfortably honest. That doesn't excuse what you did, Marcus said, his voice tight. No, it doesn't, Richard agreed immediately. Nothing could. I was a privileged, insecure bully who made your life hell because I couldn't handle my own inadequacies. He paused. I don't expect forgiveness, Marcus. I just wanted you to know that I recognize what I did and I'm truly sorry. Before Marcus could respond, a knock came at the door. Alyssa poked her head in, her expression concerned. Everything okay in here? She asked. People are asking where the principal disappeared to. We're fine, Marcus assured her, rising from his desk. Just catching up, we'll be right back. As Alyssa withdrew, Richard spoke again, his voice low. One more thing you should know about the scholarship incident. He hesitated. It wasn't just me. There were others involved, people you might not suspect. Marcus felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. What are you saying? I'm saying, Richard replied carefully, that high school was more complicated than you knew, and some people who you thought were friends weren't. The revelation hung between them, an unwelcome shadow cast over memories Marcus had thought he understood. Who? He demanded, but Richard shook his head. That's not my story to tell, just keep your eyes open tonight. People reveal themselves given enough time. As they returned to the reunion, Marcus felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. The moral landscape he had carefully mapped over 20 years, villains and allies clearly marked, suddenly seemed less certain. And as he rejoined the celebration, greeting former classmates with a principal's practiced smile, a question echoed in his mind. What other truths remained hidden beneath the surface of his past? The reunion had hit its stride by the time Marcus and Richard returned to the gymnasium. A slideshow of old photographs played on a large screen, accompanied by the soundtrack of their youth. Former classmates mingled and laughed, reminiscing about shared experiences that time had polished into nostalgia. Marcus found himself drawn into conversation after conversation, his role as principal making him a natural focal point. Yet each interaction now felt layered with new uncertainty following Richard's cryptic warning. Marcus, you remember Kevin Matthews? Jennifer Abrams said, pulling forward a balding man with kind eyes. He's a pediatric surgeon now. Of course, Marcus smiled, shaking Kevin's hand. You helped me with Trig's senior year. I wouldn't have passed without you. Kevin beamed. And now you're running the whole school. Life's funny that way. As they chatted, Marcus found himself studying each face more carefully, searching for signs of hidden agendas or past betrayals. Had Kevin been involved in the scholarship incident? Jennifer, who else had been wearing masks all these years? Across the room, he spotted Dexter deep in conversation with Alyssa, their heads bent together in a way that suggested serious discussion rather than light reunion banter. When Dexter noticed Marcus watching, he straightened abruptly and raised his glass in a forced-looking toast. The evening progressed, and Marcus felt tensions building beneath the surface of polite conversation. Old rivalries and resentment simmered just below the veneer of adult civility. He overheard snippets that revealed how many of his classmates were still measuring themselves against each other. Kids all in private school. Just made partner at the firm. Second divorce, but honestly, I've never been happier. Success, failure, happiness, all quantified and compared in a competition that had never really ended. As the official program began, Marcus found himself seated at a table with Richard, Alyssa, Dexter, and his wife Charlotte, and Sarah Winters, the former debate champion turned public defender. Welcome, class of 2005. The reunion committee chair, Tracy Peterson, stood at the microphone. Can you believe it's been 20 years? Look around, we've got doctors, lawyers, business leaders, artists, and the principal of our very own alma mater. A spotlight suddenly found Marcus, and applause filled the gymnasium. He nodded in acknowledgement, uncomfortable with the attention. Dr. Johnson has transformed Westridge since taking over 7 years ago, Tracy continued. Higher test scores, more diverse staff, arts programs restored after budget cuts. Let's hear it for our very own success story. The applause grew louder, but Marcus noticed not everyone was clapping with enthusiasm. Richard participated politely, while Dexter's applause seemed almost reluctant. And now, Tracy announced, we've prepared a special video tribute to our high school years. The lights dimmed, and footage from their teenage years filled the screen: football games, pep rallies, drama productions, graduation. Marcus watched his younger self appear occasionally in group shots, always at the edges, never quite belonging. Then a particular clip appeared, the senior awards ceremony. On screen, 17-year-old Marcus approached the podium to accept an academic achievement award. As he returned to his seat, the camera caught Richard and several other athletes in the audience mimicking his walk, making exaggerated gestures. An uncomfortable murmur ran through the gymnasium. The moment lasted only seconds before the video moved on to happier scenes, but the damage was done. The past had intruded on the present, raw and unfiltered. Marcus felt all eyes on him, waiting for his reaction. Richard stared at the table, his face flushed. Beside him, Alyssa reached over to squeeze Marcus's arm in silent support. "Well," Tracy said brightly as the lights came up, clearly trying to move past the awkward moment, "who's ready for some dancing?" As music started and people made their way to the dance floor, desperate to restore the celebratory atmosphere, Sarah Winters leaned toward Marcus. "That video was inappropriate," she said firmly. "Someone should have reviewed it beforehand." "It happened," Marcus replied simply, pretending it won't change anything. Sarah studied him with the analytical gaze she likely used in courtrooms. "You've changed, Marcus. You were always smart, but now you have presence, authority. Comes with the job," he said. "No," she countered. "It's more than that. You own this space in a way you never did as a student." She glanced at Richard, who was now at the bar ordering another drink. "That must drive some people crazy." Before Marcus could respond, Dexter pushed back his chair. "I need some air," he muttered, avoiding Marcus's eyes as he stood. "I'll join you," Marcus decided, rising to follow. Something in Dexter's demeanor, guilty, evasive, triggered warning bells. They ended up in the school courtyard, a space that had been redesigned during Marcus's tenure. Where once there had been only concrete and a few sad benches, now there were planters filled with native plants, a small pond, and comfortable seating areas. "You've made a lot of changes around here," Dexter observed, his tone unreadable. "For the better, I hope," Marcus replied, watching his old classmate carefully. Dexter nodded, then fell silent, staring at the pond where koi fish created ripples in the moonlight. "Richard said something to me earlier," Marcus finally said. "About the scholarship incident senior year, said other people were involved, people I wouldn't suspect." He paused. "He wouldn't name names, but I got the impression he was talking about someone I considered a friend." Dexter's shoulders tensed. "Richard talks too much, always did." "Were you involved, Dex?" The directness of the question hung between them, impossible to evade. Dexter turned to face him, his expression pained. "It wasn't like that, Marcus. You don't understand what it was like for me back then." The non-denial hit Marcus like a physical blow. "I don't understand. I was one of 7 black kids in our class, same as you." "But not the same," Dexter insisted, his voice rising slightly. "You had it all figured out. Parents who pushed education, teachers who loved you, a brain that made everything easy. You didn't have to try to fit and you chose not to. And that justified helping Richard humiliate me." Marcus demanded, his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. Dexter ran a hand over his face. "I didn't help create those posters, but I knew about them beforehand. Richard told me what they were planning, and I didn't warn you. I didn't stop them." He looked away. "And when the administration was investigating, I said I didn't know who did it." The betrayal, 20 years old but freshly revealed, cut deep. Marcus had always believed Dexter was, if not a close friend, at least a fellow outsider who understood his struggles. "Why?" Marcus asked, the single word carrying the weight of decades of misplaced trust. "Self-preservation," Dexter admitted, the truth seeming to deflate him. "I'd spent 4 years walking a tightrope, Marcus. Not black enough for you, not white enough for them. One wrong move and I'd lose the precarious social standing I'd worked so hard to build." He shook his head. "I'm not proud of it." Marcus absorbed this, his mind reeling. "Who else was involved?" Dexter hesitated. "It's ancient history, Marcus. We were kids, people change." "I deserve to know," Marcus insisted. "I've spent 20 years thinking I understood what happened, who did what. If that understanding was wrong, I need the truth." Something in his tone, perhaps the raw hurt beneath the controlled exterior, seemed to reach Dexter. "Alyssa knew too," he said quietly. "She didn't help create the posters, but she heard them planning it in art class. Richard used the equipment there after hours." Marcus felt as though the ground had dropped out from beneath him. Alyssa, his lab partner, his colleague, the person who had seemed most genuinely happy about his success, had been complicit in his humiliation. "There's more," Dexter continued reluctantly. "About the scholarship committee visit. Someone called them beforehand, warned them they might see something disturbing on campus that day, tried to suggest you had enemies because you'd been caught cheating in AP classes." "Who?" Marcus demanded, though a terrible suspicion was already forming. Dexter met his eyes directly. "Kevin Matthews. He was competing for the same scholarship." The revelation felt like the final piece of a puzzle Marcus hadn't known he was solving. Kevin, who had helped him with trigonometry senior year, who had always seemed so supportive and kind, had attempted to sabotage his future. The scholarship committee didn't believe him, Dexter added. They checked with your teachers, who all vouched for your integrity, but Kevin tried. Marcus leaned against a stone planter, trying to process everything. The past he thought he knew was disintegrating, replaced by a more complex and painful reality. People he'd categorized as allies had been complicit in his pain. The bully he'd demonized for decades had been honest enough to acknowledge his wrongs. "Why tell me this now?" he asked. "After all this time?" Dexter looked toward the gymnasium where their classmates continued celebrating. "Because you're the principal now, you have power in this community, influence over our kids' education. And," he hesitated, "because carrying secrets for 20 years gets heavy, man." As they stood in silence, the courtyard door opened, and Alyssa stepped out, her expression concerned. "Everything okay out here?" she asked, her eyes moving between them. Marcus straightened, his face revealing nothing of the turmoil within. "Actually, Alyssa, Dexter was just telling me something interesting about senior year, about some posters and an art classroom after hours." Alyssa's face paled visibly even in the dim courtyard lighting. "Marcus, save it," he said, his voice tight. "I need to get back inside. I'm the principal, after all, expected to make an appearance." As he brushed past her, returning to the reunion he now wanted nothing more than to escape, Marcus felt a lifetime of carefully constructed narratives crumbling around him. The line between victims and perpetrators, friends and enemies, had never seemed so blurred, and the night was far from over. The remainder of the reunion program passed in a blur for Marcus. He smiled for group photos, applauded as former classmates received Most Changed and Traveled Farthest awards, and even gave a brief, polished speech when called upon, all while his mind raced with revelations. Kevin Matthews, now standing near the dessert table laughing with former science club members, had tried to sabotage his scholarship. Alyssa Chen, currently avoiding his gaze from across the room, had remained silent while knowing about the planned humiliation. Dexter Washington, his wife Charlotte at his side, had chosen social acceptance over warning a fellow black student about an impending racist attack. And Richard Keller, the villain of his high school narrative, had been the only one honest enough to acknowledge his wrongdoing without being confronted. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. For 20 years, Marcus had built his understanding of his high school experience around a clear moral framework. He had been targeted because of his race and academic success by privileged bullies, while fellow outsiders had been allies in his struggle. That framework had informed not only his memories, but his approach as an educator and administrator. As the formal program concluded and the reunion shifted to mingling and dancing, Marcus found himself approached by Carlos Rodriguez, the former band kid who had become a successful composer. "Dr. Johnson," Carlos greeted him with genuine warmth. "I've been hoping to talk to you all night." "Carlos," Marcus responded, forcing himself to focus on the present moment. "Congratulations on your success. Your work on that Netflix series was incredible," Carlos beamed. "Thanks, but that's not what I wanted to discuss." He lowered his voice slightly. "I wanted to thank you. What you did for me senior year, I never forgot it." Marcus searched his memory. "I'm not sure what you mean." "The music program funding got cut," Carlos explained. "I was going to lose my chance to perform at the state competition, my best shot at a music school scholarship. You organized that fundraiser, got the whole academic club involved. Made it happen even though we barely knew each other." He shook his head, emotion evident in his eyes. "Changed the course of my life." The memory returned to Marcus, a small act of solidarity he'd nearly forgotten. "It was the right thing to do," he said simply. "Not everyone would have seen it that way," Carlos insisted. "You recognized an injustice and fixed it, even though it didn't directly affect you." He glanced around the gymnasium. "That's rare, especially in high school." As Carlos moved on, Marcus felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Sarah Winters, the public defender, holding 2 glasses of wine. "You look like you could use this," she said, offering him one. He accepted with a nod of thanks. "That obvious, huh? I've spent 15 years reading people in courtrooms," she replied with a small smile. "Your principal mask is good, but it's slipping." They moved to a quieter corner of the gymnasium, away from the dance floor where Richard was now attempting to teach a group of former classmates a dance that hadn't been popular since their senior year. "Something's happened tonight," Sarah observed. "You've learned something that's shaken you." Marcus considered deflecting, but found himself too emotionally exhausted for pretense. Let's just say my understanding of our high school years is undergoing significant revision. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. I'm not surprised. We were all living different realities back then, seeing only fragments of the truth. She sipped her wine. In my work, I've learned that most people are neither as guilty nor as innocent as they first appear. Even Richard, Marcus asked, nodding toward their former classmate. Especially Richard, Sarah replied. Do you know what happened to him after graduation? When Marcus shook his head, she continued. His father's business collapsed in the 2008 financial crisis. Major fraud investigation. Richard lost his college fund, ended up working construction while taking night classes. She paused. He rebuilt from nothing without his father's connections or money. The business he has now, he earned it. The information added yet another layer of complexity to Marcus's evolving understanding. Before he could respond, he noticed Alyssa approaching, her expression resolute. I need to speak with you, she said to Marcus, her voice quiet but firm. Privately. Sarah tactfully excused herself, leaving them alone in their corner of the gymnasium. I know Dexter told you about senior year, Alyssa began without preamble. About my involvement or lack thereof. Your silence was involvement, Marcus replied, the hurt still fresh despite the decades past. Alyssa nodded, accepting the rebuke. Yes, it was, and I've carried that guilt for 20 years. She met his eyes directly. When you came back as principal, interviewed me for the art teacher position. I almost withdrew my application, couldn't believe you'd hire me if you knew. Why didn't you tell me then? Selfishness, she admitted. I needed the job, and cowardice, I didn't want to lose your respect. She took a shaky breath. But seeing you tonight, hearing everything you've accomplished, the lives you've changed, the contrast with what I failed to do back then is unbearable. Her honesty disarmed him somewhat. Why didn't you speak up when it happened, Alyssa? I thought we were friends. We were, she insisted. At least I considered you a friend, but I was also terrified. She glanced around the room, lowering her voice further. Richard's father was the biggest donor to the school's art program. Without his support, we wouldn't have had the equipment, the supplies. My whole college application portfolio depended on that program. She ran a hand through her hair, clearly distressed by the memory. I told myself it wasn't my battle. That you were strong enough to handle it, that you'd get the scholarship anyway. All the excuses that let people stand by while others are hurt. Her eyes filled with tears. I've spent my teaching career trying to atone for that failure, creating a classroom where every student feels safe and valued, where bullying is confronted immediately. But I've never properly apologized to you. Marcus absorbed her words, feeling the sharp edges of his anger begin to soften, not disappearing, but transforming into something more nuanced. Thank you for telling me, he said finally. 20 years late, but still. A commotion from the center of the gymnasium interrupted their conversation. Richard Keller stood on a chair, calling for everyone's attention, his movements suggesting he'd had more than a few drinks. Hey, class of 2005, listen up. He called, his voice carrying across the room. I've got something to say. The music faded and conversations halted as all eyes turned to Richard. Marcus felt a surge of dread. We're all here pretending, Richard continued, swaying slightly on his makeshift podium. Pretending we've outgrown who we were back then, pretending the past doesn't matter. He scanned the crowd, his gaze eventually finding Marcus. But some of us have never acknowledged the damage we did. An uncomfortable murmur ran through the assembly. Richard's wife approached the chair, clearly intending to get him down, but he waved her off. I was terrible in high school, Richard announced. Entitled, arrogant, cruel, especially to one person. He pointed directly at Marcus. Dr. Johnson over there, our principal, the guy whose life I tried to make miserable because I was insecure and jealous. The gymnasium fell completely silent. Marcus stood frozen, unprepared for this public acknowledgement. Scholarship incident senior year, that was mainly me, Richard continued, his voice breaking slightly. I organized it, I created those racist posters, and I never faced any consequences. He looked around at their stunned classmates. But I wasn't the only one involved. Some of you helped, some of you knew and said nothing. We all contributed to a culture where that kind of behavior was acceptable. Several people shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with both Richard and Marcus. I apologized to Marcus privately earlier tonight, Richard said, but that's not enough. Public harm deserves public acknowledgement. He raised his glass toward Marcus. I am sorry, truly sorry for who I was and what I did. You deserved better. We all deserved better. With that, he stepped down from the chair, the silence in the gymnasium absolute. All eyes turned to Marcus, waiting for his response to this unexpected public confession. 20 years of carefully contained emotions threatened to overwhelm him. The professional mask he'd worn all evening, the composed, successful principal Dr. Johnson, began to crack under the weight of the moment. And in that pivotal space between past and present, Marcus faced a choice that would define not only this evening, but his understanding of his own history. How would he respond to this belated reckoning? Marcus moved slowly through the parted crowd, each step deliberate until he stood face to face with Richard. The gymnasium remained silent, 2 decades of unresolved history hanging in the air between them. "Thank you," Marcus said, his voice quiet but carrying in the stillness. "For your honesty, it's overdue but significant." Richard nodded, his eyes reflecting a mixture of shame and relief. Marcus turned to address the entire room, scanning the faces of former classmates, some concerned, others uncomfortable, a few openly emotional. "High school was difficult for me," he began, his professional tone giving way to something more personal. "Being one of few black students in a predominantly white school meant navigating spaces where I was hypervisible and invisible at the same time. The scholarship incident was just the most blatant example of the racism I experienced daily." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "For 20 years, I've carried a straightforward narrative about those days. I was victimized by bullies like Richard, while fellow outsiders were my allies." His eyes found Dexter, then Alyssa, then Kevin. "Tonight I've learned that reality was more complicated. People I considered friends remained silent or were actively complicit. And the person I cast as my chief tormentor is the one standing here publicly acknowledging his wrongs." Attention filled the room as classmates shifted, perhaps wondering if Marcus would name others involved. Instead, he continued, "I returned to Westridge's principal because I wanted to create a school where no student experiences what I did, where differences are celebrated rather than targeted, where bystanders become upstanders, where mistakes are addressed directly rather than swept under the rug." He looked around the gymnasium. "And I'd like to think I've had some success." Carlos Rodriguez began to applaud, joined quickly by Sarah Winters and a growing number of others. But Marcus raised a hand to quiet them. "But I've also realized something tonight that I hadn't fully grasped before," he continued. "My high school experience, painful as it was, doesn't define me, nor should it define any of you." He turned back to Richard. 20 years ago, you were a privileged, insecure teenager who made cruel choices. Tonight, you're a man with the courage to publicly acknowledge those wrongs. Both versions are true, but neither is complete." Marcus addressed the room again. "We all contain multitudes, past selves we've outgrown, present selves we're still figuring out, future selves we're working toward. The question isn't whether we were good or bad in high school. The question is who we choose to be now today with the wisdom of 20 additional years." He noticed tears on several faces, nods of recognition from others. "I don't know if I'm ready to forgive everyone involved in what happened," Marcus admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "But I am ready to acknowledge that we were all just teenagers, navigating a complex social landscape with immature brains and limited perspective. And I'm ready to honor the growth that's happened since." Richard stepped forward, extending his hand. "Thank you," he said simply. Marcus hesitated only briefly before accepting the handshake. The gesture wasn't full reconciliation. Some wounds were too deep for such immediate healing. But it was an acknowledgement of shared humanity, of the possibility of growth and change. As their hands clasped, applause broke out across the gymnasium. Not the polite, perfunctory kind from earlier in the evening, but something more cathartic and genuine. In that moment, it seemed the entire class of 2005 released a collective breath they hadn't known they were holding. The music resumed and the formal tension of the moment dissipated, though its impact lingered. As people returned to conversations and dancing, there was a different quality to their interactions, more authentic, less performed. Alyssa approached Marcus, her eyes still damp. "That was remarkable," she said. "You had every right to name names, to hold grudges. No one would have blamed you." "What purpose would that serve?" Marcus replied. "Public shame rarely leads to genuine growth." "The educator in you," she observed with a small smile, "always focused on the learning opportunity." He nodded, then added more seriously, "But that doesn't mean there aren't consequences, Alyssa. Trust is earned, it can be rebuilt, but it takes time." She accepted this with a nod. "I understand, and I'm willing to put in that time if you'll let me." Before Marcus could respond, Dexter joined them, Charlotte at his side. "Marcus," he began hesitantly, "what you said about us all being teenagers navigating a complex landscape, that was generous." "It wasn't generosity," Marcus corrected him. "It was accuracy. We were kids, Dex, black kids trying to survive in very different ways." He studied his former classmate. "I chose academic excellence and unapologetic blackness as my armor. You chose social camouflage and compromise. Neither approach was perfect." Dexter's eyes widened slightly at this framing. I've never thought of it that way. I've had 7 years as an educator to develop that perspective, Marcus replied. Watching students navigate similar dynamics, making similar choices. Charlotte squeezed her husband's arm. Dexter's been carrying this for years, she said quietly. He's made sure our kids understand the importance of standing up for others even when it's difficult. Marcus nodded, acknowledging this without offering immediate absolution. That's how we grow, by learning from our failures, not by pretending they never happened. As the evening continued, Marcus found himself approached by classmate after classmate. Some offered apologies for past indifferences or microaggressions they'd only recently come to recognize. Others shared stories of how his example, his academic excellence, his resilience, his current leadership had influenced them over the years. Kevin Matthews eventually made his way to Marcus, his expression troubled. Richard's speech, it made me realize I've never properly acknowledged what I did, he began awkwardly. Calling the scholarship committee, Marcus supplied evenly, suggesting I cheated. Kevin's face registered surprise, then resignation. Yes, it was inexcusable, driven by competition and jealousy. Yet here you are, a successful surgeon. The scholarship clearly wasn't the only path to your goals. No, Kevin admitted. But at the time, it felt like everything. He hesitated. I've often wondered if my actions affected your chances. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. I got the scholarship, Kevin, and I've spent my career ensuring other students have the same opportunities, regardless of background or circumstance. As the reunion drew to a close, Tracy Peterson announced the last dance. Partners paired off, moving to the center of the gymnasium as a ballad from their senior year played. Marcus found himself standing near Richard, both of them watching the dancers. You know, Richard said after a moment, my daughter is a sophomore here now, Maddie Keller. I know Maddie, Marcus nodded. Bright student, active in debate club. She talks about you all the time, Richard continued. Principal Johnson said this, Principal Johnson implemented that. She's pretty impressed. He paused. Especially with the new anti-bullying program you started last year. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. It's important work, Marcus said simply. Yes, Richard agreed, his voice solemn. More important than I understood at 17. He glanced at Marcus. I want her to be better than I was, to understand things I didn't. That's the goal of education, Marcus replied, for each generation to learn from the mistakes of the previous one. As the final notes of the song faded, Marcus surveyed the gymnasium, the space that had once been the site of his greatest humiliation now transformed into something else. Not a place of complete healing or perfect reconciliation, but a space where truth had been spoken, where growth had been acknowledged, where the past had been faced honestly rather than buried beneath social niceties. Tracy returned to the microphone. And that concludes our 20-year reunion, class of 2005. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you in another 5 years. As people gathered their belongings and said their goodbyes, Marcus found himself walking with Alyssa toward the exit. Will you be okay? She asked. After everything that came up tonight, Marcus considered the question carefully. I think so, he replied. Not immediately. Some revelations need time to process, but eventually. And us, she ventured. Our friendship, our working relationship. That will take time too, he said honestly. But I believe in second chances, Alyssa. My whole educational philosophy is built on the idea that people can learn and grow. He met her eyes directly. I just need to see that growth in action consistently over time. She nodded, accepting these terms. That's fair. Outside, the summer night was warm and clear, stars visible despite the suburban light pollution. Former classmates called farewells across the parking lot, exchanged phone numbers, promised to stay in touch, the usual end-of-reunion rituals. Marcus stood by his car, keys in hand, watching as the class of 2005 dispersed once more. Richard waved from across the lot before helping his wife into their SUV. Dexter and Charlotte stopped briefly to shake Marcus's hand before departing. Kevin nodded solemnly from a distance. 20 years of narratives had been disrupted tonight, comfortable categorizations of villains and victims complicated by new information. The moral clarity Marcus had constructed around his high school experience had given way to something messier, but perhaps more true. As he drove away from Westridge High School, the building where he'd experienced both his greatest pain and his greatest professional achievement, Marcus reflected on the journey from marginalized student to respected principal. The path hadn't been straight or simple, and tonight had revealed blind spots in his understanding of even his own story. But perhaps that was the most valuable lesson of all, that growth required ongoing reassessment. That healing wasn't a destination, but a process. that understanding others' humanity meant acknowledging their capacity for both harm and redemption. Tomorrow, he would return to this same building not as a reunion attendee, but as Principal Dr. Marcus Johnson. He would walk the hallways with a slightly different perspective, see his students with even greater nuance, approach his educational mission with renewed purpose. The past couldn't be changed, but it could be understood differently. And in that new understanding lay the possibility of something Marcus hadn't fully anticipated when he'd reluctantly attended this reunion. Not just closure for old wounds, but opening to new wisdom. The school sign glowed in his rearview mirror, Westridge High School building tomorrow's, leaders today. As it faded from view, Marcus smiled slightly. There was work still to do, both in the school and in himself. And for the first time in 20 years, he felt fully ready to do it. Don't forget to subscribe to At Persifistories for more powerful narratives that challenge your thinking and touch your heart. Comment below with your thoughts on forgiveness and personal growth. Have you ever reconnected with someone from your past and discovered a new perspective? And if you enjoyed this story of reconciliation and moral complexity, please share it with someone who might need its message today.